Запишу вас. И, okay, so можемо продовжити. We can continue. So now I'd like to introduce Shelley. How should I pronounce your family name?
Pershon.
Pershon, like French, Pershon.
It's originally French, yeah.
Pershon. Okay, Pershon, who comes from she has a very interesting business called English Unlocked, and her speciality is helping speakers of English as a first language to speak more in a way which is more understandable for speakers of English as an additional language, among other things. So I'm very excited to hear what she has to tell us today. So Shelley, when you're ready, please start. Also, if you are not presenting, please turn off your camera and your microphone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim, for inviting me to the conference. Yeah, I help people here in the UK. I'm based in Newcastle, and my clients work as doctors, social workers, lawyers, and they help people who have moved to the UK. So their clients might be Ukrainian, or they might be from any other country. And I support them and help them to modify the way that they speak and to simplify the way that they speak, but in a way that's not patronizing. Not like this, don't talk like this. I don't know if anybody has moved here from another country and experienced that patronizing way of speaking. I help people to avoid that and to speak clear English in a way that's not patronizing. I'm not the only person present today that does this, because I noticed that we've also got Matt Halsdorf and Christian Saunders here, who have produced a really great free resource on this called the Language Adapter. So hello guys, it's nice to have you here. It's a very small industry. I'm one of the only people that's providing this service. But yeah, Matt and Christian do the same thing. So what I'm going to share with you today is an exercise similar to something that I do during my training. And the exercise is interactive. So if you've got a pen and paper with you, that would be great. If you could write the numbers 1 to 4 on the left, going down 1, 2, 3, 4. You're going to try to understand me when I speak a foreign language. It's not Ukrainian, I'm afraid. I don't speak any Ukrainian. It's Spanish. So something that helped me to develop these skills as a clear communicator is the experience of moving to Spain and learning Spanish. I taught English there. I was an English teacher for over 20 years. So I'm going to say a sentence in Spanish and you're going to try to understand it if you can. And it's going to become progressively easier to understand this. Each time that I repeat it, I'll use a technique that you can use when you're speaking a language, any language, to a person who speaks that language less well than you do. That could be English, but it could be any language. So when you listen to the sentence in Spanish, just write down anything that you understood. And if you didn't understand anything that I said, that's fine, just write 0. And then each time that I repeat it, write down anything that you understood. At the end, I'll be asking people to share in the chat what they think I said. And I'll be asking people to share with us as well, at what point did you understand what I was saying, if indeed you managed by the end to understand it. So here goes. I hope you're ready. A mí me gusta el té, pero el café no. So if you didn't understand that, Don't worry about it. If you're not a Spanish speaker, that's normal. Just write 0 and get ready for the second go.
Could you repeat it, please? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, I'm going to repeat the same thing 4 times. And each time I say it, it's going to become progressively easier. May I ask, did you hear it the first time? Or did I cut out?
I've heard the first phrase and I missed I just had internet connection. I think I missed the last few words. I was just super curious.
Right. Okay. Well, you're going to get another chance to hear it, and it's going to be easier. So don't panic. If you didn't understand that, that's quite normal. I spoke at natural speed Spanish. I didn't make any concession for the fact that you're not a Spanish speaker, so it would be difficult. So just write 0 for number 1, and here comes number 2. Okay. A mí me gusta el té, pero el café no. I hope that was a little easier. At the end, we're going to revisit what I did each time, because we can learn a lot from how I modified the way that I spoke there. So for the third one, you need to make sure that you're looking at me, because I'm going to use facial expression and mime to add some, to make it easier for you. So here goes. A mí me gusta el té, pero el café no. In a moment, I'll give you the 4th repetition. Okay, so for the 4th one, it's going to be just the same as the 3rd one, except here is some context. You've no idea what imaginary situation we're in. So let's imagine that we are having a conversation about our likes and dislikes. And I say, a mí me gusta el té, pero el café no. So now's the moment of truth. Could you type into the chat what you think I said? But if you are a Spanish speaker, maybe don't join in. So Carmen. Yeah, so Carmen got the meaning. Several of you got the meaning, and Tetiana has written it in Spanish. I'm guessing that you are actually a Spanish speaker because your spelling's great too. Okay. So for those of you who already speak Spanish, obviously that was easy from the start. I hope that we can all learn from how it became progressively easier for people who don't already speak Spanish. Thanks for the joke, Chris. I'm glad you're all interacting. This is great because I can't see you, which makes me feel a little bit like I'm just speaking into thin air. And I really appreciate you participating like this in the chat. So yeah, that sentence means I like tea, but I don't like coffee. So what did I do that made it easier? We can learn from what I did. So the first time that I said it, I ran all the words together and you couldn't tell what I said unless you already spoke Spanish well, because it just sounded like a stream of noise. And when people try to understand a language that they're not yet proficient in, whether that's Spanish or English or Ukrainian, that's how it sounds when people speak at natural speed. Part of the problem is that we speak in connected speech. That's the correct way to speak when you are fluent in a language. Now, the second time that I repeated the phrase, I didn't speak in connected speech. I separated each word so you could hear where one word finished and the next word started. That's what it sounds like when I do it in English. I call that unlocked English. And you heard me do the same thing in Spanish. It was very clear where the boundaries between the words were. And I hope that those of you that speak other languages will agree when I say that that is one of the hardest things. You listen to a foreign language and you just think, what? How am I supposed to pick out the words? It's just a stream of noise. So when I train people in this skill, I train them to do this in English. We use sound waves. It's not easy to stick those breaks in between each word, but it makes a big difference for the person that you're speaking to. So in the third repetition, what I did was I brought in visual clues. So I used my face and I used my hands. So mime and gesture and facial expression can all really help. It helps, I think, if you give the facial expression or the gesture slightly ahead of the spoken word when you're speaking to a beginner, because it gives them time to process what you're saying. They see the facial expression like this, and they think, oh, it's going to be something negative. And then they hear the word, it's easier for them to understand. I also tied in those visual clues quite tightly to the individual words that I said, instead of being all over the place. So that's the second tip, is to, don't overlook how important it is to use visual clues to help your listener. So my third tip, and I'm going to leave you with 4 tips. My third tip is to think about context. And that's the difference with the 4th repetition. I revealed what the context of the situation was. And so often people are trying to listen in to a conversation and they don't have that context. This might be cultural difference, or it might be something specific to that situation that you're in right now. They just don't have the context, the backstory, and it makes it much harder to understand. I'd be interested to know, at what point could you understand that phrase? Could you type that into the chat, please? Was context the game changer for you? Or was it something else? After that, we'll come to tip number 4. So for Carmen, it was context that revealed the meaning. Does anybody else want to reveal at what point they got that? Was it what you could just type a number, 1, 2, 3, or 4? Did you get it on 1, on 2, on 3, or on 4? Elena got it on 1. Elena, are you a Spanish speaker, or perhaps you speak Italian or another similar language? Okay, so you do speak some Spanish. So yeah, context makes a big difference. And if any of you work as interpreters, I'm sure you'll agree that if you are given an interpreting assignment, especially if it's over the phone and you're just thrown in and nobody briefs you in advance, it's much harder. So that's also a tip that works when you are working with interpreters. So you may be wondering what the final tip is. And the final one is simply repetition helps. And sometimes we can be a little bit too quick to rephrase. This was my experience when I lived in Spain. Even after I became quite good at the language, if I didn't understand something the first time, I would say, ¿Cómo? And they would helpfully rephrase. And I would think, thanks. Now I've got to start from scratch. It's like you're moving the goalposts every time. I recommend that instead of always rephrasing, you give somebody a second chance to hear what you said using the same words. I didn't alter my wording. I altered the way I said it. So it's a good idea to just repeat the same words, but perhaps a little bit more slowly or a little bit more clearly, and see if they understand it the second time. And if they still don't understand it, okay, well then think about how could you phrase this differently. So Vivian is deaf and is sharing in the chat that that she finds that it's the same. So Vivian, something that I recommend during my training that people avoid doing, and I wonder if you've experienced this, is when people over enunciate and exaggerate every syllable. It's really patronizing, isn't it? So yeah, that's something to avoid. And you've had 3 tips there of things that do help. And I'm sure that Tim would be grateful if I wrapped up a little early, since you're running behind schedule. Tim, is that what you would like me to do? Would you like to go to questions, or is there anything that I can add?
Thank you very much for that. Do we have questions for Shelley? Well, in that case, I will ask sort of 2 quick questions. Have you ever learned sign language? You talked about the use of gestures, and do you think it's worth learning sign language or learning some acting techniques in order to unlock your English?
I don't know enough about sign language to know whether it's self-explanatory, but I think that that's the key. When you're thinking about bringing in gesture or mime, it's important to remember that some gestures are culturally rooted. So this one, for example, we think it's universal, but it's not. And it's actually really rude in certain countries. For example, parts of Africa and the Middle East, that's a rude gesture because it comes from our history and the Romans, you know, gladiatorial combat. So gestures which are not self-explanatory are less helpful than mime. So that is, oh, hello, Emily, you're in Newcastle too. Well, let's connect. You'll have to look me up on LinkedIn. So would you like to nominate another question, Tim, if you feel like there's time?
There was one more question, a brief one in the chat from is how do you train yourself to phase out phrasal, sorry, I just missed it. I'll repeat it. How do you train yourself to phase out using phrasal verbs for non-native speakers?
Well, first I have to break the news to them that phrasal verbs exist. And that takes a few moments for that to go in, that they've been using phrasal verbs all their life. There are 5,000 of them in the English language. And guess what? They're really difficult for people who are trying to understand English as a foreign language. And then I suggest that people begin by looking at their written English, because when you're speaking, you've got fat chance of eliminating phrasal verbs because they're everywhere. But when you're writing something, you do have chance to reflect and start to think, oh, was that an idiom? Was that a phrasal verb? So that's a good place to start. And if anybody would like a free resource, on the English Unlocked website, there is an ebook which gives tips on how to write. So most of my training is about how to speak, how to modify the way that you speak English, but I can also help people to modify the way that they write English. And there's a free ebook on the website with tips for that. And it mentions phrasal verbs.
Great. So I think in the interests of time, let us continue to the next speaker. But thank you very much, Shelley, for this interactive talk and very revealing talk. The next speaker is Peter Merritt from Lancaster University, and he's here in person. So I will hand over the microphone to Peter now.
Right, I don't know if I'm audible like this at all, or does it need to be a bit closer? Or is it on?
You should that should be fine.
Is that fine? Yeah.
Can everybody sorry. Can everybody hear Peter?
All fine. Okay. So well, thank you for having me, Tim. I'm here to talk about a challenge that I did to learn Ukrainian in 1 week. So I feel like obliged to say a little bit in Ukrainian just to start with. Привіт усім. Мене звати Пітер. Я студент в Ланкастері. І 2 місяці тому я зробив челендж. Я вивчав українську мову 1 тиждень. Я зробив челендж, тому що я хотів збирати гроші для України. Але після челендж я забув багато слів. І я хочу стати краще. Але це складно. І зараз я розмовляю англійською. So what I did was, as I explained there, 2 months ago, I decided to do a challenge to learn Ukrainian in 1 week. So what I basically did was to raise money for charity. I did this challenge and I booked 50 hours of lessons online with Ukrainian teachers, majority of them living in Ukraine at the time as well. And it was a very difficult process, of course, and on top of that 50 hours, there was about sort of 10 hours maybe of independent study too. So I took the whole week off work, didn't study or anything like that. It was just completely Ukrainian. I recorded some of the lessons as well, and there's a YouTube video that you can find, which is just need to type in learning Ukrainian in 1 week, and a good friend of mine edited and did that all for me. This was, as I said, this was done for a charity, so you can find on the GoFundMe page, if you again typing in learning Ukrainian in 1 week, if you want to donate to British Ukrainian Aid, you can find it there. And I think there was something else that I wanted to mention as well. And yes, I suppose one of the things that I did really want to include here is that I did have to exaggerate the claim a little bit, saying I was going to learn to speak Ukrainian in 1 week. I think a lot of people think, oh, he's going to be fluent in 1 week. Of course, it's not possible. I mean, Ukrainian is a language that takes about 1,100 hours of study in order to learn, and there's me doing 60. So of course, it was a little bit ambitious, but the main thing was to be able to achieve some level of basic fluency in which you could have a conversation about general topics. And so the test of this challenge came at the end of the week, when I had to have a conversation. I had to have 2 conversations which were recorded and are in the video with 2 friends of mine, actually 2 students of mine, because I'm an English tutor whilst I study here at Lancaster. And and so it was a really great experience, because for the first time I was speaking to my students who I always speak to in English, or who I had always spoken to in English. I was speaking to them in Ukrainian for the first time. So yeah, so you can find that video online, as I said. And I think the main thing that I want to sort of highlight about why why I enjoy learning languages in general, and why this learning Ukrainian was such an amazing experience, is because you really just get to connect with people in such an incredible way when you learn their language. And I know what I'm talking about today is more of an anecdote, and the speakers who we've heard so far are talking about far more sort of important things and so on, and about how to learn the language better. Whereas I'm just sort of want to just focus on the sort of the personal fulfillment you get from connecting with someone from a different culture to you. I mean, if you take Ukraine, it's okay, there's all sorts of differences, but you really just kind of bulldoze through that cultural barrier between you and say Ukrainian, for example, when you start speaking their language. And it really is sort of an incredible experience that I just can't recommend enough. And so finally, before if anyone were to ask me anything in Ukrainian, I would say that I'm probably might not be able to understand, because I haven't really studied a whole lot of Ukrainian since the challenge, and I think the first thing to go is all my listening skills. So I do apologize, but yeah, I think that's everything. Yeah.
Я дуже дякую, Peter.
Будь ласка.
Я прочитав тут. Wow, for 1 week is amazing. І вона має рацію. Після одного тижня це неймовірно. So, молодець.
Дуже дякую. Я розумію. Добре.
У вас запитання для Петера? Does anyone have questions for Peter? And Peter actually does not only speak Ukrainian and English, but several other languages as well. Yes, shall I give you? All right, so I'll hand you the microphone.
It's a question for you, Peter, which I'll deliver in English, and you can respond in English. Well, first of all, thank you. A comment to say what a wonderful example you have given us all of how language learning can be fun, inspiring, and can get really quick results. And one of the great challenges that we have in spreading enthusiasm for languages, especially in Britain, is a kind of defeatist attitude that language learning is incredibly hard, and that people need to spend years and years and years before they can even say, I like tea, but I don't like coffee, to give a recent example. So well done for that. So my question to you, though, is what was the most challenging aspect of Ukrainian language learning during your week, and how did you overcome it?
Okay, thank you very much, by the way, for your comments there. And so right, the most challenging thing about Ukrainian, there's quite a few things I could say, and so when it comes to, I think the grammar is really, really difficult, and the answer to how I overcame that, I haven't. I still make a lot of issues with the grammar, and especially if I'm speaking in a very spontaneous way, if it just I just so happened to be speaking to a Ukrainian person, and it's sort of a very sort of organic interaction like that, then yeah, I've really just abandoned all sorts of the grammar, really. But I think that the key thing is to be understood. I think in general that there are quite a few things I could point out that were really, really challenging. One of them is just the volume that I was having to cover in just 1 week, you know, and sort of 50 hours of lessons just from sort of Monday to Sunday was just was quite brutal at times. So sometimes just maintaining concentration. But yeah, I think grammar it has got to be probably the hardest thing. I think, yeah, grammar definitely.
Okay. Are there any more questions for Peter? Bільше запитань для Петра. Okay.
You were on national radio, that live or recorded?
Oh, that was live both times. Yeah, that was, yeah.
That the most worrying thing.
Yeah, it was quite worrying, especially the second time, because they asked me they asked me to speak a bit of Ukrainian live on air, so that was a bit worrying. I think I just about pulled it off, and luckily there was a Ukrainian, actually a Ukrainian friend of mine on the radio as well, who sort of said that I wasn't talking gibberish, so that was good.
Yes. But if you haven't, seen these videos on YouTube or on Instagram, do so. They actually are a very good example of what Peter was saying in his lecture, that you can see how the people he is talking to are very touched that he is learning Ukrainian. That's very obvious for the conversation. Yeah. Oh, we have one more question here. Яка наступна мова? Which language are you going to learn next?
So the language I'm going to learn next is Chinese. So 我说的是中文 and that's 太好了 that's about it for the moment. But yeah, so Chinese is the next language that I'm learning, and I started this about 3 weeks ago. But I'm committed to continuing Ukrainian, so not in such an active way as I have done in the past, but maybe sort of one lesson a month and so on, just so I don't forget, because I want to keep it in there. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Are there any more questions for Peter? Okay, then I will just ask one quick question then. You're a language teacher, or a language tutor, certainly, and also a language learner. If you were to give one piece of advice to people who want to learn Ukrainian, what would it be?
I think my piece of advice for people learning Ukrainian would be my advice for actually someone learning any language. You can apply this to any language, and it would be to do a lot with a little. And this is to say, target the words that get used often, that get used commonly, and really, and with that you can start practicing conversation quite quickly. And another thing with conversation, and this comes back to learning words that are relevant and useful, is the fact that conversations are actually quite formulaic in a way. You tend to find that if you actually want to strike up a conversation with a Ukrainian, for example, well, there's only so many ways that conversation is going to go to start with. It's, there'll be hellos, there'll be how are yous. Now, then you need to start thinking, well, they might be quite surprised that you've learnt Ukrainian. So you might need to prepare for an answering how you learnt Ukrainian or why you learnt Ukrainian. And all these little incentives, lead you to really useful words. And you won't even know that many words to start with, but you will very quickly be able to be very efficient with them and use them really well.
Yes. Right. One last question. Matt Holsdorf has asked, do you feel you learned something about Ukrainian culture while learning the language?
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing about this is something that I didn't mention about language learning is you can't really separate language from the culture, especially a language like Ukrainian, which you only find in Ukraine. It's exclusively endemic to Ukraine, and so yeah, you end up learning so much about the culture. And so yeah, the simple answer really, yeah, is yes. Yeah.
Okay. You actually bring up an interesting point. English is perhaps the opposite, in which you can become very good at English, but have very little contact with cultures where the population speaks English, or actually having interacted with so-called native speakers. Yeah, but certainly, but that's another discussion, I guess.
Yeah.
Any last question for Peter? In that case, thank you very much, and we will move on to our next speaker, who is Emily Richardson. Yeah, so Emily has a website and gives a lot of, advice on language learning in general. She also has a podcast called the Language Confidence Project, which I've listened to and contains a lot of thoughts on how to improve your language learning. But Emily, I will hand over to you now. So at the moment we can see, but how do I know I'm doing it right?
Oh, okay, give me 1 second. That is a problem. Right, can you still see and hear me well, even if you can't see the right screen?
We can hear you and see you.
Perfect. Okay. Can you now see the screen that with a very, very colourful background on it?
Yeah, we can see three things. We see the first screen, the Language Confidence Project. Then on the left, we see the different the first 4 slides, and then we see your notes underneath on the bottom. But we can see the slide itself very well.
Mm-hmm.
It's still very clear at the size you present it.
Okay, how's that?
Yes, now it's full screen.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I am so enjoying listening to everybody tonight. It's been a really, really interesting night so far, so thank you so much. I am Emily Richardson, and I'm the founder of Tea With Me, which is a creative and colourful space for multi-passionate language learners who want to carve their own path in their language learning. My academic background, I have a degree in French and linguistics from Oriel College, Oxford, and a master's in applied linguistics, with a particular interest in psycho and neurolinguistics. And before I started this venture, I was teaching English, French, Spanish, and beginner Mandarin, mostly to children aged 11 to 18, but I've also worked with adults and also very young children. And as Timothy said, I am also the owner of the podcast, The Language Confidence Project, which airs every weekday to offer a dose of language courage to anybody learning any languages, whether they love it or whether they don't, but they've got to learn one anyway for career or other circumstantial reasons. And for me, the question that underpins all my work is, how do we get people unstuck in their language learning? Because I don't believe that the problem is that people don't know what method to use. And I also don't believe that the problem is laziness or that people are just bad at languages. So in everything that I do, I am trying to change that conversation. And so here is what I think is happening. So for most of the people I work with, their very first experience of learning a foreign language was in textbook world. That is what they did at school. And then when they decided as an adult that they wanted to learn either the same language and go back to it or a new one, that was their first thought, and it's what they default back to. And the thing with textbook world is that it is really safe and it's really predictable. It starts with book 1, chapter 1, section 1, exercise 1A, and it goes topic to topic in order, myself, my family, my school life, my work life, my pets, my town. And then it revisits them at intermediate level, and it revisits them at advanced level, becoming ever more complicated. So the world of work becomes employment and unemployment, or school life becomes education, and food becomes about nutrition. But at any point, you know that in order to make progress, you just need to move on to the next prescribed step. And there is a really clear finish line. The end of the book, the end of the course, it might have an exam date attached to it. Maybe you get a certificate at the end and someone tells you that you can stop now. The path is clear and everybody around you is on exactly the same path. So you've got that support there. But as soon as you need to use that language for a really specific purpose, you need to go into a job in that language, or you decide you want to make, you want to bring up children in that language, if you married into it, for example, you find that the language you learn in textbook world can feel quite removed from the rest of your life, and especially as adults. Because chances are your main interests won't be covered, the specificities of your job won't be covered, and the language you learn won't really reflect what you actually spend the majority of your time doing and thinking about. So when you want to go into the real world with your language, to have the conversations you want to have with the people you want to have them with, at some point, we have to make the decision to leave textbook world, that time where you have to break down all the walls between chapters and venture into the language wilderness. And the funny thing is, with the language wilderness, you'll find that a lot of the people there have been there right from the start of their language learning journeys. And actually, their journey started pretty much the same as yours. The beginning was equally well defined. They knew what they needed to cover, the alphabet, the greetings, the colours, the numbers, the days of the week, and they knew roughly in what order to cover them. And there were also lots of beginner resources out there, which largely all supported each other. But then it gets to the point where all the possible roads diverge. When you're freestyling your own language learning, you can go to whatever topics feel the most relevant to you, in whatever order you want, and you can learn them in whatever ways suit you best, seeking out information in whatever format you like the most. And on the surface, it should be great, but we start to feel lost, we start to feel lonely, and it starts to get noisy. And the finish line seems so far away, we can barely see it, and we don't even know exactly where it is or how to know when we've arrived there. And I think there are a few things going on here. We've got more resources than ever, more formats than ever, more choices than ever. We've got all these podcasts and apps and methods, experts on YouTube and on social media and writing blogs, and they conflict. And there's all of this advice about routines and study habits and productivity hacks. So many different books. If we're not sticking to one textbook, there are so many ways to get that same information, and products and services are being advertised to us from every direction. And it creates a real whirlwind of all of these advantages and disadvantages where every individual thing is more suitable for people in certain circumstances or with certain learning preferences or different goals. But actually, a lot of the time, we don't really know what we're looking for. And when that happens, we just go round and round in circles. We take a step in one direction and we doubt ourselves, so we come back. And then we start in another direction. We think maybe that was less efficient than the last thing I did. Or we move in one direction and we stick with it for a bit, but then we watch this video on YouTube of someone telling us this exact thing we're doing now is his single biggest language regret of 2021. So we think, okay, we'd best not do that. And every time we think we've figured out the next step, we end up right back where we started, except that now we're frustrated, we're tired, and we're wondering quite seriously if this is ever going to work. And whatever step we take, there's always that voice that says we could be and we should be doing something else. And that is when people come to me or they find my work. And they say things like, I'm just not the kind of person that can stick to things. I'm always moving on to the next thing. Or they say, I'm no good at languages. Or in Britain, sometimes it's, well, British people are just no good at languages, are we? Or they say, I'm overwhelmed. But quite a lot of the time, and more tragically, people don't say those things. They just quietly give up. They get busy. Or they think, well, I've always wanted to learn Japanese, so I think this is the perfect time to abandon my Spanish and do a deep dive into Japanese. And either way, they're all responding to this same roadblock that's throwing them off. And it can absolutely be the difference as to whether they see their language goals through to completion or not. And so, is the problem simply that they didn't know what apps to use? That if someone were to just tell them the best study habits or hand them a nice ecosystem of flashcards and bilingual texts and podcasts and a spaced repetition app, they'd be ready to see this thing through to the end? Well, I don't think so. Here's what I think is going on here. In my work, I often talk about how you are a whole person learning a language, and that's something that's come up tonight when we were talking about integrating our whole self into the language before the conference started. That language learning works best when you bring in your whole personality, all your likes and dislikes, and your prior experiences, and you tailor the whole process to your current circumstances and your lifestyle. But it is not as simple as just that, because we're not as simple as that. Being one whole person doesn't mean being one completely united brain learning a language. And a lot of the time, it's actually a lot more like being a village learning a language where the villagers don't all agree. They have different goals, different priorities, and they're all shouting over each other. And that is what's pulling you in all the different directions. It's not the sheer quantity of resources or the amount of conflicting expert opinions, because if these townspeople were all on the same page, you would filter out 95% of them right from the start. But all the townspeople are gravitating to different things and latching on to different expert opinions. And that, to me, is the core issues here. So I have set out 4 pairs of the most obnoxious duos that I have in my village. but you may well have some more of your own to add. The first obnoxious duo is the Scrooge and the timekeeper. The Scrooge thinks anything we spend our money on is a waste and always points out that if we're willing to sacrifice more time, we can reach our language goals for free or for cheaper. And the timekeeper is fretting that we're already behind and that if we could just convince the Scrooge to spend some money on this, we might stand a chance of doing it faster. Next is the perfectionist and the curtain twitcher. Now, these two are not opposites and they are not at loggerheads, but they egg each other on in the worst possible ways. The perfectionist thinks that if we don't do it right first time, it wasn't worth doing in the first place. We must be the best and we must avoid mistakes at all costs. Whereas the curtain twitcher is always looking at what everybody else is doing and providing a running commentary of how well everyone else is doing compared with us, and reporting that right back to the perfectionist. The inner child versus the schoolmaster. The inner child just wants to have fun. The inner child gets bored easily and is always looking for the next new and shiny thing in language learning. That might be a specific app or method, it might be something, a topic to play with, or it might be the next language. Whereas for the schoolmaster, learning is a really serious business, and if we're having fun, we're not learning. And the other thing that the schoolmaster needs is a constant feed of data. If it can't be measured by numbers, it didn't happen. To be reassured that there's progress, we need numbers. And finally, the strategist who wants to know how anything we decide we're going to try fits into the master plan of our language learning, versus the naysayer, who resignedly maintains that it doesn't matter what we do because it is never going to happen for us anyway. So how are we going to stop that noise and stop that conflict? Well, to be really clear, we want to stop the noise, but I don't think we want to shut out any of the voices. I'm not sure it's even possible to do that, but even if it was, I don't think it would be wise, because for all their complaining and bickering, every villager does bring up a good point sometimes. The problem is they're always going to be shouting that anything you give to one of them is stealing from another one. So let's metaphorically call a town meeting. Let's get them all into a room and figure out what their main priorities are, and then look at how those things fit in with your overall language goals. That way, we're using their wisdom, but we're containing the rest. So first thing, let's choose who we're going to appoint as the chief advisor or the chief advisors. So if you are in a time of financial instability, the Scrooge's voice might well be the most important. And if you have deadlines looming, it might be the timekeeper. But then once we've done that, let's see if we can let any of the rest of them off the hook entirely. The Scrooge, for example, might calm down a bit if you give him a solid budget to work with, or if you decide to just focus on free or pre-bought resources for a while. You might be able to calm the schoolmaster down with some pedagogical theory on how useful gamification can be in language learning, or by having a system to record and document and show off the progress you've already made as proof that what you're doing is working. You're probably not going to get them all singing from the same hymn sheet, but even just being aware that they're here might mean that their protestations won't take you by surprise so much or throw you so far off course. And the final question I want to close with today is, but how do I know I'm doing it right? And to answer that, I'm going to just ask one question, which is, do you have a really clear end goal? You need a really vivid picture of what you're actually trying to do in your language so that you can reverse engineer your path from there. Because if your ultimate quest is to be able to volunteer for an organization helping Ukrainians new to this country, for example, your path logically should look so different if it's efficient and well planned to people who just want to be able to make friends and have a vibrant social life in their new language versus people who want to conduct business meetings or collaborate with a foreign university. So if you're working from your ultimate goal backwards, you should be able to create really efficient routes to get there. And you will know when you're on a bit of a detour and straying away from that goal. You'll know when you're ultimately spending too long on something that probably won't make that much of a difference to the image you're holding in your heads. So the single biggest thing I'd love for you to take away from this presentation is that if you're feeling stuck, you are not alone. Language learning can be difficult, it can be long, and whatever method you use, you will have to put yourself out there and take some risks. But don't let the villagers send you round in circles. You are doing this right. Have a wonderful evening, and if you would like to say hi, I'm on Instagram at @teawithemily. My email is there, and my podcast is the Language Confidence Project. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Are there any? Right. Well, I liked your description of as an unashamed inhabitant of the language wilderness. I particularly liked your visual depiction of it, especially because there are lots and lots of ups and downs in language learning. Okay. And I also one of the last points you made was that you know, the way in which someone who wants, you gave the example of somebody who wishes to help, you know, new Ukrainian arrivals. That's very different from somebody who would like to have a social life with Ukrainians or would like to sort of collaborate with the Ukrainian university, so on. One thing I've noticed in textbooks and group learning, which many people are used to, are designed in with very general subjects to try to be reasonably acceptable to a wide audience. So, but then I think a lot of people are not suitable. Group teaching is not suitable for a lot of people, but there are many people who think that's the only way to do it, in my experience. What would you say to somebody who says, well, I know this course has a lot of material that's not relevant for me, it's not suited to my objectives, but I don't know how to study by myself?
I would say there's sort of naturally an apprenticeship phase where actually you're learning how to learn, and that happens alongside all the rest of the things that you're studying in your language. And I think if you're happy if you want to stick with a textbook for a while, even though you know that your main goal is not being covered, that's okay. It's a trade-off. But what I do want people to know is that that trade-off is being made. So if it feels safe, if it means that you're going to do something rather than nothing, a textbook is definitely a positive thing. And this is also not saying that we should ban textbooks from our language learning. It's saying there needs to be a real awareness of what your day-to-day tasks are and how they're lining up with your eventual goal.
Okay. Right. So are there any more questions for Emily? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much. May I suggest that we have another short break? Thank you to the speakers for keeping to time, much better than in the previous session. We will add. I suggest we have is a 3-minute break okay now, and then we can restart at 19:15. So we're only 5 minutes behind. So I'll stop the recording now, but I will restart it in 4 minutes. Okay.